Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. And with me today is Richard Paul Evans, who has an impressive resume. He's the author of 24 consecutive New York Times best-selling novels. He has won the American Mother's Book Award, Romantic Times Best Women's Novel of the Year Award, 2 first-place Storytelling World Awards for his children's books, the German, I can't even say it, Les Esprits Gold Award, 3 Wilbur Awards, the Religion Communications Council. His books have been translated in more than 18 languages, and more than 17 million copies are in print worldwide. But today we're not going to be talking about his excellent novels. We're going to be talking about a fabulous little book called The 4 Doors, A Guide to Joy, Freedom, and a Meaningful Life. Mr. Evans, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on.
Just so glad to have you for a lot of reasons. If somebody reads this book and they're not moved emotionally, they have no heart. It really is a powerful book. And you mentioned early on the teachings that have shaped your life, and it's some of the same people I'm very fond of, especially Scott Peck and Marianne Williamson. But you mentioned Og Mandino and C.S. Lewis and Wayne Dyer and Miguel Ruiz. And I was wondering, what is it about those particular authors that reaches you?
Oh, everyone has a message to share, and they're all terrific. The first that I read was Og Mandino, and as a youth, he's the first one to open up my eyes to possibility, and then Dr. Wayne Dyer with his book Your Erroneous Zones. It's I'm grateful for these people who have shared things throughout my life that have made my life better.
Mm-hmm. Well, we start off this book with why you wrote it. Let's talk about that a minute, because the scenario you set where you're visiting some students in a charity for abused children, and you got them crying before it was all over.
Well, what actually happened is I had been a school teacher came to one of my book signings, and she gave me some money that her students had raised for my charity for abused children. Mm-hmm. And she asked if I would come by and say thank you. And so without any planning, I went by to visit a couple dozen students. Instead, when I got there, the teacher was very excited. She said, we're so excited you're coming. We've made it a district-wide assembly. You have an hour. So here I was not prepared for what I was walking into. Excuse me. And so, panic sets in. I'm looking over this large crowd of kids, and it hits me. Tell them everything you wish you knew when you were their age. And so that's what I did. For the next hour, the inspiration just poured through me, and I noticed that some of the kids were crying, and when I finished, they jumped to their feet in a standing ovation, and they formed a line, and some of them wanted to be hugged, and it was an amazing experience, but that was the beginning of a journey. I have since shared that talk with more than 100,000 people around the world, and I've shared it in maximum security prison blocks. I've shared it with the top MBA graduates from Harvard. And after every sharing, I've been asked if I have a copy of the talk or if it's in a book form. And so I knew I would someday write this, and this is it. And after all these years, I finally have put it in a book form, and I'm sharing it with people who wanted more.
Mm-hmm. You declare early on that you believe in an all-loving, purposeful God who's willing to give us hard things so that we might progress spiritually, and that introduces some principles that I think are pretty interesting. Would you talk a little bit about self-will and spiritual evolution and change and so on?
Yeah, it begins with, there's some premises that the book is based on, and that is that we can make changes in our lives, mm-hmm. and that we do this through the exercise of self-will. If that's not true, then there's no point of writing the book. I mean, we don't have any control, but we do indeed have control through our decisions and through the exercise of our will. The 4 Doors is about how to shape our individual mental maps to bring us freedom and joy, and to free us from our false beliefs. Since the moment we were born, we began creating these maps of what the world looks like. And what I've discovered as I travel the world, that many people, and maybe most people, don't realize that they have this map, that their map is not the reality. For instance, if I look at an American flag, I'm filled with devotion and reverence. If someone from another, from a different ideology looks at it, they might be filled with scorn and hatred. And it's the same flag. The reality is the flag, the material. The mental map is how we view everything around us. Mm-hmm. And just far too many people don't realize that the map is not the road. The beauty of this is that by correcting the map that we can get places we didn't think we could. The second part of this is that all of our maps are flawed. That we've all learned things that were incorrect, and we've all made false assumptions. And so the Four Doors is a way to clean up that map, to put it in line with reality, and to put us in a position of power instead of a position of bondage.
Mm-hmm. You declare early on, and it's emphasized again, and I think the first door, that we're not an accident of God or nature, that the universe is demonstrably purposeful. I'll admit I've already used that and quoted you in a presentation I did Friday, because that really stuck with me, that we're here for a reason.
Well, if you look at in the grand picture, you see the universe. Then you look at the small picture, you see the in the small universes, the molecular structure that is very similar to the larger universe, and we see these particles, and they all have a place and a purpose and an order, and then we forget that we're part of that universe, that we do indeed have a purpose and an order. Mm-hmm. But this is the first door is understanding that there's a purpose. We're here, a reason we were born. The belief of this is vital to personal success, and if you study the lives of people who have changed the world, and I've studied the lives of more than 300 people, from Archimedes to Charlemagne to George Washington to Henry Ford to Steve Jobs, and looking for that answer, what is it that they have that's different than the rest of humanity that can barely affect their neighborhood? And the one thing that I could find that they all had in common was this belief that they were supposed to change the world.
Mm-hmm. That effort to change, you deal with a good bit about the spiritual being able to change just like the physical one is, and actually how the physical may affect the spiritual, or at least the mental, by taking care of ourselves and helping ourselves grow and spiritually and move towards the light, and choosing between love and hate and forgiveness and resentment, peace and anguish. How does that play into the Four Doors? Where do you? Well,
because so much of the Four Doors is about freedom, and the second door is about freedom and about freeing ourselves from limitation. One thing you can see is that the physical body does affect the spirit. You've seen people who are drug addicts or who are sex addicts, and you can see how it affects their spirit, how their spirit becomes in bondage. On the other hand, you've seen people how the spirit can affect the body. People who are filled with malice and hate, you can see how their body, how they become sick and ill and dying. And it's like they impact each other, and understanding that we are both is vital to the Four Door principles.
Mm-hmm. When we think about freeing ourselves from limitations, you develop that particular door in a variety of ways. It starts with a great quote by Winston Churchill: "Don't be content with things as they are." But you described scientific discovery and when a paradigm becomes an obstacle to progress, and changing our mental paradigms is a key part of this, I would say.
Right. There's three main cages, and the first is paradigm, the second is fear, and the third is the attitude of victimhood. Mm-hmm. And paradigm's a really powerful one because we don't even know we're surrounded by it. Paradigm is accepting things as they are, to just look around us and thinking this is all there is. There's a story in there, and I'm sure you read it, about Clarence Otis Jr. It's a fascinating story. He's the CEO of one of Darden, a Fortune 500 company, employs more than 250,000 people. But Clarence is one of the few African American CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. He was raised in Watts, which is in a suburb of Los Angeles. It's a slum, and he was there during the civil unrest in the 60s. And you think, how did someone come from the slums to run one of the biggest companies in the world? It was about paradigm. Every Sunday, his father would put his kids in the car. They would drive 20 miles to Beverly Hills, and he would drive through these wealthy neighborhoods. He did it not to engender class hatred. He did it to show them that there was another world out there. And the impact on that, on his life, in his own words, it was everything. It showed him that there was more. And this is important for us to understand, to use our imaginations and to imagine more for ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And to think of him being with a father in Watts and going to Beverly Hills and eventually becoming the CEO of all those parts of the conglomerate of Darden restaurants, Red Lobster, Olive Garden, Longhorn Steakhouse. I mean, it's a pretty impressive transition. But go ahead.
Well, no, it is. It's amazing. But that's the power paradigm.
Yeah, but there's something that I've seen used other places about the crab mentality, and I'd like to touch on that a little bit too, because
it's actually a popular saying in the Philippines. The idea of crab mentality, that if you throw some crabs in a boiling pot of water, you can put them in a shallow pot and they can climb out if you put one in, but if you put two in, it can't climb out because the other crab will grab it and pull it back in. The less inspired are afraid of people succeeding because it leaves them behind. Anyone who's been on a serious diet knows what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
There's a story in there of a woman who lost 300 pounds. Her husband was trying to sabotage her by bringing donuts home every day, and he denied it, of course. It's like, no, but subconsciously he was terrified his wife would get thin and leave him.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the way people are, and there's an argument that perhaps America is becoming a giant crab pot, that rather than everyone rising and inspiring, that let's just break the people who are succeeding.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned one of the lessons that your father gave you, and it was when the Christmas box, well, probably your best-selling of all your bestsellers, you got famous for it, and we found that friends stopped talking to you and family stopped visiting and people spread false rumors. And your father said, you have to understand that your success will always remind others of their failures. And I had never thought about it quite like that.
Yeah, that was a very profound thing he said, because at the time I was very sad. Even some of our family wasn't talking to us. My wife's sister, she only has two sisters, one just wouldn't even speak to her. And finally she tracked her down and went to her house and said, why won't you return my calls? It's been months. And it's like, and her comment was, you and Rick never cared about being wealthy. We do.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to be wealthy, and we can't stand to see that you have it and we don't.
Wow.
At least he was honest, but that's the crab pot mentality, rather than saying, good for you, that's exciting, and it shows that I have hopes, that I have a hope of achieving my dreams.
I want to back up a minute, because I was thinking about the fact that you said that life is going to hand you some problems, and out of this you have the opportunity to choose to grow. You had a pretty challenging childhood through the years. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I did. And it's interesting, because I've had a few reporters who were just really surprised. They said, well, we just thought, 25, best-selling books that you just were raised in a life of privilege. And it's like, no, pretty much the opposite. And when I was little, I had a mother who suffered with severe depression, and she was suicidal. And I talk about in the book, and with her blessings, I love my mother. It's hard sharing these things. Mm-hmm. One night I came home to our house, was crowded with people, and I said, why is everyone here? And someone said, your mother just slit her wrist. She's killed herself. I said, my mother's dead? And they said, yeah. And she actually wasn't dead, but she had slit her wrists, and she was at the hospital. And it was an ongoing thing with my mother, and I spent years just trying to save her life. And I look back, and on top of that, I had Tourette syndrome and really struggled with severe tics. And we also had huge money problems. By the time I was in high school, I had lived in 7 different homes, because we kept losing homes and being kicked out of apartments. And so we went to, it wasn't an easy childhood. But my point was, in talking about victimhood, it's like, I don't use those experiences to define who I am. They made me who I am, and I'm grateful for them in hindsight, because they shaped me in ways that an easy life couldn't have done. So the problem with victimhood that we see people grabbing onto is that, first, it takes our power and gives it away to some other person or some other external event. Second, it denies the life truth that many of our greatest blessings come wrapped as adversity. Mm-hmm. And so that's the danger of victimhood that our culture seems to be just so enamored with right now.
Another thing that struck me about that, the notion that greatness can come from anywhere, if one imagines it and one looks deep inside themselves, they can find that as one of your themes. But the little bit you told about Route 36 in northern Missouri blew me away.
Isn't that cool?
It's like the birthplace of General Pershing and J.C. Penney, Walt Disney, Mark Twain.
Even sliced bread came from a little stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere.
That may explain the expression.
It's really kind of stunning. It's like, what do these people have? You walk around, it's like there's nothing here. It's like, that's right. What they had was imagination. Mm-hmm. They instead of limiting themselves to this tiny little locale, they said, no, my imagination is boundless, and they took it as far as they could and changed the world. So, I mean, that's the power of imagination.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to look at your resume because it's so impressive. You are world famous, but you make a point about how greatness has very little to do with fame. The greatness does not require a PR firm, is a quote I'm going to use again and again.
Well, that's something I wanted to point out, because I do, especially when I'm speaking with youth, I meet a lot of kids who are confused about the difference between greatness and fame. There's a lot of famous people who are anything but great. There are many great people who aren't famous, and fame's a vapor, as Twain said. It's not something that's worth striving for, and in my case, it's a tool to help, to accomplish things and to get the word out. But outside of that, it's like fame disappears. Greatness is something that happens. It's eternal. It's greatness is that person who steps up and protects his family, protects his country, protects his wife and children. I mean, and that's greatness.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that you state that really hit home for me was everyone who's walked the planet has been wronged in some way.
Right.
And you just can't afford to define your life by what hurts you, because that's not what it's there for. And then I love the story about the DJ who drank Drano.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But this is a common story. In his case, he drank Drano and burned his tongue. He couldn't speak, and so after all those years of and it's Mark Van Wagner. All these years of speech therapy, he has a beautiful voice and became a very popular radio show host and almost broke out into the national scene. He's very talented. But that's a really commonplace story. You hear about the child who had polio, polio as a child, and then they run in the Olympics. Mm-hmm. We can take these challenges and turn them into the best of us. And so I have an analogy or a metaphor in there about grapes. We lived in Italy in the Chianti region, and I asked a farmer I said to a farmer, "You must have really great soil to grow these grapes." He said, "No, you can't grow good grapes in good soil. The reason that Chianti grapes are so delicious and so famous is that the soil is so blanched that the vines, to survive, create these massive root systems that bring up not only the nutrients it needs to survive, but it brings up a whole lot more, and resulting in this wonderful grape."
Yeah, I like the line that grapes are lazy. The soil needs to make them work hard, right?
Well, I mean, and so are we. I mean, or we're smart. We don't like pain. I don't like pain. We try to avoid it, but you have to realize that at some point, you can exercise and feel a little bit of pain every day, or not exercise and feel a lot of pain every day.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah.
You need to. It's just part of life.
And you declare yourself. I mean, you mentioned Tourette syndrome, and there's some touching stories there about how difficult it was for you at summer camp and so on. But when someone came up to you about how his wife had lost a child and the books you'd written had brought her back, and it's no coincidence that you write books with compassion and empathy, you do that precisely because you have Tourette's.
Right.
And that, in fact, you wouldn't, if you had to give up the lessons and strengths that came from it, you wouldn't do it. You would choose Tourette's.
No, and I actually saw a study that showed that most people, if they could have their disability cured, but they'd have to give up everything they'd learned from it, they wouldn't do it. That they would keep their disability. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly true. I've come to appreciate my Tourette's and be grateful that I was born with Tourette's.
Mm-hmm. Let's touch quickly on forgiving self and others, because that's a powerful part of this as well.
Yeah, forgiveness is freedom, and I recommend you read the book to understand, as I talk about, what the nature of forgiveness truly is. But one thing that is really intriguing to me is that how often we practice double jeopardy, against the Fifth Amendment, that we actually try ourselves over and over for the same crime. And this is unjust. And so I have a technique in there that actually works, that will free you from past wrongs and help you forgive yourself.
Now, we've talked a bit about believe there's a reason you were born, door 1, and door 2, free yourself from limitation. Let's talk about magnifying your life for a second.
Door 3 is magnify your life, which means to expand it to the breadth of your potential, to have the life you want to have. It doesn't mean you have to be Lady Gaga or Elton John. It's like what it means is growing within your power, within your full ability, and to not have regrets. So you're having the life and the experiences that you want. And so that's what it means to magnify your life. And there's really two really important aspects of that. The first is to dream again. And we've all had so many dreams shattered that we sometimes we get afraid to dream. And so I have a technique in there I call the what if technique. And this is a technique that creative writing courses teach, what authors use. You ask what if. What if a young man discovers that he's really a powerful wizard? That's Harry Potter. What if a young lady moves to a small town, falls in love with a boy she discovers is a vampire? It's Twilight. These stories start with what ifs. Well, our own stories start with what ifs. A decade ago, my wife came to me and she's had a what if. She goes, "What if we just moved to Italy for a couple of years?" I thought, what? We can't do that. It's like, well, that's your first response to the what ifs usually are that we can't do that. And after we explored it, we ended up moving to Italy, and we had a wonderful life experience. I had more time with my family and my children than I have at any other time in my life. We got so close. I got closer to my wife. And I remember I came back, and one of the psychiatrists who works with my charity, he said to me, and he goes, "Wow, that was really good for you." And I think, that was a wonderful what if. And here's an assignment for our listeners today. Write down 3 what ifs today. 3 what ifs. What if I became active instead of having a sedentary lifestyle? What if I wrote that book I've always dreamed of? What if I opened that bakery I've always wanted to do? To make the what ifs and start focusing on it and see where it goes. The second part of magnifying your life is then to take riskful action, to move ahead with it. And we often don't because we're afraid of failure, and to instead look at not as failure but as your life as an exploration, that you are an explorer, and that even our failures are better than non-action. In fact, sometimes our failures are the best thing that have ever happened to us. So,
you quote Helen Keller there about how avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than exposure to danger. But I also like the great Gretzky quote, "You miss 100% of the shots you don't take."
Right. I started a business about 5 years ago. It was a massive failure. I lost millions of dollars. It created horrible ill will. It was a really tough thing. It broke my health. And I thought, what an awful experience. And now, 5 years later, I look back and I think, what a blessing. Because of that, I started writing more. I started 2 series, which became huge. It generated hundreds of thousands of new readers, and I learned so much through that experience that now I look back and I think, wow, I was a baby before that happened, and I'm grateful that I was thrown into that situation.
You want to tell the story about how you joined the bestseller authors one time?
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite stories is I call "Take the Seat," and this is so applicable to all of us. Back in those days, we didn't have Amazon.com, we didn't have ebooks, and so if you wanted to, sell a book, you had to go visit the little mom and pop stores, and there were thousands of them. And so I was at a show in Denver, Colorado. I had a booth there, and I'm looking for booksellers, and I just didn't see any. And so finally, I go to I go to the show manager. I said, "Where's all the booksellers?" And she said, "Well, they're in another hall with the authors." And I go over there, and sure enough, there are hundreds of booksellers lined up to meet this long table that they'd bring in like 4 best-selling authors at a time, and they would get a free book and get it autographed, and they'd be like Mary Higgins Clark or John Grisham, and I'm looking at this and thinking, that's where these are the people I need to meet. That's where I need to be. And I notice there's an empty seat at the table. And it occurs to me, you want to be a best-selling author? Take the seat. And I'm thinking, I could take the seat. They didn't invite me. There's guards up there. And I turned and walked away and said that, it's just not fair. It's stacked against you. And then it hit me. That's a victimhood mentality. If you don't believe in your dream, who will? Who will fight for it? So I went back and got a stack of books, walked around that circle, sat down at that table, and suddenly a volunteer noticed me. She comes walking over to me, and I looked up and I said, "Sorry, I'm late." And she didn't know what to say. And she goes, "Well, let me get you some water." And that day I signed books for hundreds of people, and I got them in the bookstore's hands. The next year, I went back there. I was the second best-selling author in America. And I went back there. I was on the cover of the program. I had an entourage with me. Went to that same show. I went to the same table. I sit down, and that same volunteer was there. And I said to her, "Do you know who I am?" And she said, "Of course I do, Mr. Evans. Everyone here knows who you are." And I said, No, do you remember me from last year?" And she kind of squinted, and she goes, "Last year?" And she goes, "Oh, my gosh, you're the guy who crashed the book signing." And I said, "Yes." She goes, "You did it. You made it." And I said, "Yeah, thanks for not throwing me out." And she said, "Well, I was going to as my job, but looked at me. I just couldn't do it." It's that seat's open for all of us. You want to have a good marriage? Take this seat. You want to travel the world? Take this seat. There's these empty seats, and we're just too afraid to take them.
I want to bring out the point of consistent effort, not because of how good it is to make that point, but because of how often I encourage people to read. Don't care what they read if they just keep reading. And you mentioned if you were to read just 10 pages a day in 1 year, you could read The Great Gatsby, Madame Bovary, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Crucible, Brave New World, Animal Farm, On Liberty, 1984, Beowulf, and the complete works of William Shakespeare. And I just found that a staggering statistic and a great application of statistics.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. But I want to touch on the last story. I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk about developing a love-centered map, because at the heart of it, that's the one that's probably the most important.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As I talked about that map, we have the highest aspiration of man is love. We are at our best. We are at our strongest in love. We have false perceptions of love, of what love is. And to build a map based on love is to create a powerful life. And it is, I would maintain, the only purpose of life. We came here to learn how to love. And that's what, that to me is the greatest purpose. And when we're filled with love, we do magnify our lives. And the Bible tells us that perfect love casteth out all fear. It's like we don't limit ourselves with fear or entitlement or victimhood, because you wouldn't do that to someone if you have love. So it's a very powerful thing, and it's a really wonderful thing. And I think it's just a really interesting explanation of what love is. That I think your listeners will find interesting in the book.
And that would be the Italian expression?
Ti voglio bene, yeah.
Which basically means I wish you well, or I want good for you.
I want good for you.
And that's where love lives, is in wanting the best for the other person you care about.
Right.
This is a beautiful book, an inspiring book, and I hope everyone will pick up this book by Richard Paul Evans, The 4 Doors, A Guide to Joy, Freedom, and a Meaningful Life. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I appreciate your listening. You know that we broadcast 4 times a week, twice on Thursday and twice on Sunday. But if you miss those broadcasts, you can pick up the podcast on Good Books Radio Facebook page or www.goodbooksradio.com. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.